Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Welcome to our home.
We turn to page 14 in our prayer books, bottom of the page. How wonderful today is. Ma yafeh hayom Shabbat Shalom.
Ma yafeh hayom Shabbat Shalom. Ma yafeh hayom Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. We welcome you to our services and our home. We really need Shabbat this week, so much more than usual, much as we always need Shabbat. This is the end of 11 days of protests, of pain in our country, remembering the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And this murder is just one in a sequence of many murders over many weeks, over many months, over many years, where police, usually white, where citizens sometimes, usually white, treat black life, African American lives, as cheap, where they don't matter. I can't breathe was not just the phrase of George Floyd as he was dying, but no person of goodwill can breathe freely as long as there isn't appropriate policing, as long as there isn't empathic, deep and profound care for all the citizens of our country, minorities of all kinds. Until we feel that, we are not the country of our dreams. We are not America the beautiful. We are not the land of justice and liberty for us all. So we need healing. We need healing tonight. We need healing as a country in the days and weeks ahead. And most of all, as one rabbi said, it isn't enough to be a good person. We have to be an anti-racist person, calling it out whenever we see it, and making sure our country lives up to its ideals. So I'm glad we're all together tonight. I'm glad that we're all singing, learning, and feeling together as one community. Let me share a reading with you. The sun will come up, and I will get up for my restless night, heart heavy, and go about my day. There will be beauty in the world, and laughter and music, and also heartache, and also love. There will be a community of like-minded friends with whom to commiserate, and a long laundry list of ways to make a difference. Yes, there must be a sense of responsibility to shake off the malaise, the numbness, the shock, to understand the forces that led us here, to help comfort the discomforted, to participate in the healing of the brokenness, and to do it with urgency. We will act out of conviction, knowing that democracy is not a spectator sport. We will grieve and rage and wonder how and why, but we will also need to learn patience. For like the phoenix, long-lived and regenerative, our day will come again. May it come soon. Love does trump hate, and though long, the arc of the moral universe does bend towards justice. These words from a poem called The Morning After by Rabbi Pamela Wax. We join together for the blessing over the Shabbat candles.
אשר קידשנו במצוותיו ציוונו להדליק נר של שבת.
Join together singing Shalom Aleichem, found in our prayer booklets on page 1.
Shalom Aleichem, מלאכי השרת, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. שלום עליכם, מלאכי השרת, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. בואכם לשלום, מלאכי השלום, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש שלום, מלאכי השלום, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. ברכוני לשלום, מלאכי השלום, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. זה איתכם לשלום, מלאכי השלום, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. שלום עליכם, מלאכי השרת, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. שלום עליכם, מלאכי השרת, מלאכי עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא.
Again,
Shabbat
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Now we turn to another reading that I've got in front of me. We've used it at services a number of times over the years. Usually when we're thinking specifically about America and the American experience of democracy. We last used it, I believe, last Thanksgiving when we were together with the Irvine United Congregational Church, a mosque, and 2 other churches. This is our vision for America. Break down the ancient enmities and make peace in our land. Let the rich share power. Let the old advise and consent. Let the young create and dissent. Let us love the good in our country more than we hate the evil. Bring into common life all those who are left out and who feel left out. Give hope to all who have reason to fear the future. Give passionate determination to use the great wealth and power in our nation so that children may live in a decent home, go to a first-class school, have opportunities for jobs suitable to their talents, and so that the aged may also abide in security and dignity. Restrain the reckless among us and curb the violence in us all, so that we may defend the weak pursue justice without partiality, and conduct ourselves with forbearance. That which is evil in us, let it die. That which is good in us, let it grow until there is brotherhood and sisterhood from sea to shining sea, and we become in truth, as in hope, America the beautiful. We continue in the bottom of page 1, welcoming in the Shabbat Queen, Lecha Dodi.
Lecha Dodi, likrat kala, penei Shabbat, nekabla, Lecha Dodi, likrat kala, penei Shabbat, nekabla, Lecha Dodi, likrat kala, penei Shabbat, nekabla, Lecha Dodi, likrat kala, penei Shabbat, nekabla.
Our young Cantors continue with Baruch Hu.
These words come from the poet Adrienne Rich. What would it mean to live in a city whose people were changing each other's despair into hope? You yourself must change it. What would it feel like to know your country was changing? You yourself must change it. Though your life feels arduous, new, unmapped and strange, what would it mean to stand on the first page of the end of despair?
We turn to page 4. In a few moments, we'll join for the Shema. Let's close our eyes and take some deep, relaxing Shabbat breaths, breathing in Shabbat, letting go of the stresses and pain of the week. Breathe in Shabbat. Later this evening, right after the service ends, we have a wonderful speaker who I'm going to be interviewing, Lichtblau, who is dedicated to his journalistic life to focusing on hatred and how to overcome it. Let's do that during our few moments before the Shema, not globally, not politically, just personally. What can each one of us do to welcome in those who are different by religion, by race, by culture, by ethnicity? What can each of us do in all of our spheres with friends and colleagues and neighbors? What can each of us do to make a difference, to move towards racial harmony? Breathe in Shabbat.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kevod, Shem Kevod Malchuto, Leolam Vaed. Ve'ahaveta את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך, ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובישעריך.
As our Cantor gets ready to sing her next song, Blowing in the Wind, I'd like to read these words. These words come from a Buddhist prayer for peace. May the loving kindness within me find expression. May the inner dangers within me know resolution. May my mind and body be healthy. May I find peace and be truly happy. The Millennial young Cantors, our former teenage young Cantors, now in their 20s, will be leading us in a moment in Misha Beirach, a prayer for healing. There's a lot of healing that we all need. Some are healing from diseases of various kinds, some from COVID-19. Some feel the pain of our society, the dis-ease, the disease of racism, the disease of just thinking about one's own group. Some people are focused on hatred or polarization. All of us are in desperate need of healing in one way or the other. And our country and our world definitely need the blessing of healing. Misha Beirach.
Misha Beirach, Avotenu, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. May we be healed, may we be blessed with His shalom.
turn to page 11 in our prayer books and we read together these words from the poet Judy Chicago, reminding us of the vision of the biblical prophets. And then all that has divided us will merge. And then compassion will be wedded to power. And then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. And then both men and women will be gentle. And then both women and men will be strong. And then no person will be subject to another's will. And then all be rich and free and varied. And then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance. And then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old. And then all will nourish the young. And then all will cherish life's creatures. And then all will live in harmony with each other in the earth. And then everywhere be called Eden once again. Please rise on the same page for Mourner's Kaddish. We remember so many people from our families, our friends, those who are no longer alive but taught us so much. We miss them terribly on a yard site on the anniversary of a death or a recent death that happened during this past year, or someone we remember from a long time ago. In addition, because of societal racism, these people can no longer breathe. Ahmaud Arbery, Stefan Clark, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Oscar Grant, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, George Floyd. For all those whom we remember, Zichronam Livracha, their memories are a blessing to us all. We join together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'alma divrach hirutei v'yamliach malchutei, b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, b'agala v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach li'alam u'lamei al-maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shmei kudsha b'richu. Le'ila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata damiran b'yama v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'himru amen. We join together for a prayer for peace. Oseh shalom, peace on us, peace on our people, peace for all humanity.
Oseh shalom bimromad, uyaseh shalom aleinu. ועל כל ישראל ויהימנו עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל
stay tuned for an incredible interview with a very talented journalist about racism and anti-Semitism in our society today and in the past, and what we can do in the future with Eric Lichtblau. Stay tuned. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Eric Lichtblau, who's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, a journalist, an author, the author of The Nazis Next Door, the author of Return to the Reich, a Holocaust refugee's secret mission to defeat the Nazis, and a forthcoming book on anti-Semitism in the United States. He was a Washington reporter for the New York Times for 15 years, for the LA Times for 15 years before that, and he's frequently appeared on NPR, MSNBC, and C-SPAN. He lives in Washington, D.C. Eric, it's a pleasure to have you at Shabbat services tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Rabbi.
So I want to ask you first about this incredible character who you wrote about, who is true to life because he did live. The book reads like a novel. It's the story of, I've got it right here, in fact, Return to the Reich, a Holocaust refugee's secret mission to defeat the Nazis. I read it in one sitting. It was so powerful. So it's the story about a Jew who spied on the Nazis. First, he fled Germany as a young man, as a child, teenager, and then parachuted back into Austria. So tell us Freddie Mayer's story.
Right. Well, that's a good recap of what Freddie did. I mean, he's someone who is by no means a household name, and I assume many of your congregants have never heard of Freddie Mayer before, and I never heard of him, to be honest, until about 4 years ago now. And the reason I came across his name was that I was meeting with a source of mine who had been very helpful on my last book, The Nazis Next Door, which is about all the Nazis who got into America after the war. And the person I was meeting with was a Justice Department Nazi hunter by the name of Eli Rosenbaum. And I remember as I went to meet him that day, I had read an obituary of someone in Europe who had died after helping countless Jews during the Holocaust. He was one of the righteous Gentiles. And I had never heard of this person before, and I was somewhat embarrassed. And I said to Eli, how is it that so many of these people, both Jews and Gentiles alike, who did such heroic things in the Holocaust, really died in anonymity without their stories ever really being known to a wider audience? And I said, tell me someone who's still alive today, because unfortunately these survivors of the Holocaust were and still are dying every day. There won't be many left soon. And I remember, tell me someone who's still alive that I'm going to wish I could meet before they die. I don't want to read their obituary in the paper and say, darn, I wish I'd met that person. And he said, I know just the person you should meet. His name is Freddie Mayer. He lives not far from Washington in West Virginia, about an hour and a half away. He was then in his early 90s, and there was an effort by survivors groups to get him the Medal of Honor posthumously, which failed, unfortunately, and still has not been done even today. But I soon went out to meet Freddie and was just struck by his story. Just first of all, how nonchalant he was about these incredible things that he did, which to the rest of us would have been just unthinkable. Not only fleeing the Nazis as a teenager, 16 years old, from Germany, but then agreeing with the U.S. military, the creation of the agency after OSS was created, to parachute, as you said, back into Austria onto a glacier 13,000 feet high, and then basically belly flop down the mountainside. It's amazing he survived that, but even more so, he survived for 2 months on the ground, first posing as a Nazi SS officer for about 6 weeks, and then posing as a French POW, an electrician, inside a Nazi, a Messerschmitt airplane factory for another 2 weeks, and providing this vital intelligence to the Americans that really helped to speed the end of the war in that area, in one of the critical last battlefields in Austria and northern Italy. And so I met him, and I heard his stories, and was just struck by how remarkable his mental dexterity was at that point at 94. Physically, he was getting along great. He was living by himself, was still shoveling his own driveway, chopping his own wood out in the woods of West Virginia. And then 2 months later, unfortunately, he passed away. So I ended up writing his obituary for the Times, and very soon realized that, as much as you could do in 800 words summarizing someone's life, that really couldn't do him justice. And I decided I wanted to write a book about him, because it said so much about the heroism that immigrants like him brought to America, and the immigrant experience so relevant today.
His ingenuity, his spontaneity, his spunk, all of these elements of Freddie were remarkable. If you saw it in a movie, you would say, well, the writer is a very talented fiction writer.
Yes.
But he always improvised. There was like nothing that could slow him down. And just when you thought it was the end, right?
Yes, yes.
He still found like another card in the deck to show.
Exactly.
It's just such an incredible story. Tell me about the people who helped Freddie, because he didn't do this alone. He did it with Hans. He did it with Nazi defectors. He did it with townspeople. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, his second in command really was also a Holocaust refugee by the name of Hans Winberg, who came from the Netherlands. And Hans's story is more complicated, in some ways more tragic. Freddie got out of Germany at 16 years old with his entire family, and they really were lucky, really, for this brief window in 1938. Both before that and after that, the U.S. and Palestine, the Brits in Palestine, were really shutting the doors to the refugees of Europe. But they got out really during that only opportunity. An entire family, 7 of them, got out. Hans had a very different experience. His father was worried about the Nazis long before most people in the Netherlands and the rest of Europe, and he began saving money to send his family really over in shifts to the United States. And the first ones he sent were Hans and his twin brother at almost the same time as Freddie was leaving from Germany, just by coincidence, and about the same age. So the twin brothers arrived in Brooklyn, and Freddie also ended up, by coincidence, in Brooklyn, although they never met there either. Hans's family never made it out. It was a real tragedy that haunted him and his twin brother for their entire lives. And as Hans entered the U.S. military, he was still getting letters from his family in the Netherlands, from his father. I read and quoted many of these letters, these really heartbreaking and heart-wrenching letters, but then the letters simply stopped. And then at that point, he connected with Freddie in OSS, in the U.S. military, and they were sent on a sort of ill-defined mission overseas, which ended up with them in Austria. And once there, they connected with a Nazi defector who was really almost their local tour guide, because neither one of them knew the lay of the land at all. They knew nothing about the Austrian Alps. They did not know the local towns. Freddie spoke German, but beyond that, they really relied on this Nazi defector whose name was Franz Weber, to not only show them the physical landscape, to get them down that mountain, but also to introduce them covertly to some townspeople about 10 miles outside Innsbruck in Austria, who were instrumental and really put their lives on the line. One of them had been the former mayor of the town, who was expelled by the Gestapo for being disloyal. And those people hid them away for days and weeks at a time, sent messages, cryptic messages, encoded messages back and forth, so that Hans, who was the radio operator, could telegraph them back to Italy and Washington, to OSS, about the Nazis' plans, the information that Freddie had gathered. They provided them with transportation, with food, with connection to others. I mean, these were local people, probably about a dozen in all, most of them women, because they came under less suspicion from the Nazis, who did incredibly brave things in their own right, and were not recognized for that, even in Austria, until many, many years later. So it's, as you say, as I was researching it, you wouldn't quite believe it was true if it wasn't so well documented in military archives and in interviews. And Freddie is clearly the hero when you talk about him always finding the way to survive and playing another card. One of the only member of the mission who's still alive is the pilot of the plane, who I interviewed. He's still alive at age 96. And he said that, I quoted him in the obituary I wrote for the New York Times. He said, Freddie was born without the fear DNA. There was nothing he wouldn't do. And it was all just sort of a shrug of the shoulders, and why not? I think he figured once he had escaped Germany with his family, he was living on almost on borrowed time, and anything at that point was just extra. So
the juxtaposition of Nazi ruthlessness and ineptitude, especially towards the end of the war, when everybody is kind of thinking of how is this going to play after the Americans and the Russians are victorious over us. That was a really interesting part of the book as well. And also that kind of spills over into the Nazis next door as well. So I'd like to shift now to that book, because I knew a little bit about what was in that book, but I certainly didn't know that detail. I know Elizabeth Holtzman, Representative Elizabeth Holtzman, was very instrumental in bringing this to the attention of the Congress and the country. But what was so shocking, I think most people know that Wernher von Braun was brought in surreptitiously in order to aid our missile program, but the numbers of people, the numbers of former Nazis, from lowly guards to high-ranking Nazis, who got into our country, sometimes in this trivial way where a clerk, an agent of our government, right, would say, don't put that in your document, you won't get in.
Right.
And in other places where the CIA and other agencies of government, we want these people.
Official sanction. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. It's really, I think, a shameful saga in American history, the way we let in thousands and thousands of Nazis, as you say, from low-ranking guards up through top officials, a top aide to Adolf Eichmann in the Jewish office, who lived in Northern California, another who lived right in Orange County in Seal Beach, a guy named Andrzej Artukovich, who was the head of the Interior Department for the Nazi puppet government in Croatia, and sent 600,000 people to their deaths. He lived out his life in Seal Beach, beginning just a year or two after the war. They were all around the country. They were at all ranks and levels. Some got in, as you say, just by very easily disguising their roles with the Nazis and claiming to have been prisoners of war or victims or what have you. And our immigration checks were so porous that it wasn't very, very hard to beat that. Others, were here really at the invitation of the U.S. government. The Project Paperclip scientists, Wernher von Braun being the most famous among them. There were about 1,800 of the Nazi scientists who got in. Not all of them were even scientists, but it was supposed to start as just a small group of the top scientists. It was envisioned as maybe a dozen or so, and even that there was opposition from the U.S. State Department and other agencies about the optics, really, just from a PR perspective of bringing in even a dozen or a couple of dozen Nazis. It grew and grew and grew with the backing of the Pentagon, the War Department at that point, to 1,800 in all. And it became an open secret within a few months. As I tell it in my book, it was a little hard to keep secret the fact that there were hundreds of little men with German accents wearing white lab coats in Huntsville, Alabama, or in Texas. They didn't exactly fit in. And so the War Department did really a brilliant job of PR. They embraced this. They held photo ops to say, yes, we brought in all these German scientists, and they were not ardent Nazis. That was the term that was officially adopted, because under the orders from Truman at that time, the Nazis who brought in had to be non-ardent Nazis, whatever that meant. Sort of a euphemism. A lot of people would say a Nazi is a Nazi is a Nazi. But the fact was that their records were whitewashed. So someone like Werner von Braun or his top deputy, Arthur Rudolph, who also lived in California. A lot of them came to California. They were Nazis through and through, who had been involved with the Hitler Youth, who had been early members of the Nazi Party, who were loyalists to Hitler, had met with him personally, who were involved in brutal production of German rockets and missiles on the backs of slave laborers, thousands of whom were killed and died at a place called Peenemünde. And yet their records were whitewashed so that they were just sort of Nazi in name only by the time they got to the United States.
Another painful story in the book is about how the German POWs were often treated better than the Jews when the concentration camps were liberated. The Americans identified, so to speak, with soldiers more than victims. They saw Jewish victims as scrawny, on the verge of death, not trustworthy. Whatever anti-Semitic cultural prejudices they carried with them were projected onto the Jews. And sometimes the Nazis were put in charge of the Jews in the concentration camps after we won the war.
Yes.
You almost can't believe it, except by an understanding that people can be morally obtuse. They keep kind of, I'm a soldier, so I identify with the enemy soldier more than the victim.
And that came really from the top, from General Patton, whose diary I quote in the book in the opening chapter.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, who was in charge of those displaced persons camps, and in his diary wrote of the Jewish vermin and who he thought were subhuman locusts and deserved whatever they got. And he had never seen such decrepit people. He writes about taking General Eisenhower on the tours, and he can't believe, the filth and vermin of the Jews. Really, I thought at first I found this document at the U.S. Holocaust Museum because I was doing a fellowship as a researcher there, and I thought it might be a fraud because I could not believe that General Patton, who is held, as this military hero in history, was such a raging anti-Semite, which is certainly not commonly known. And that passed on down through the ranks. We think of the liberation of the concentration camps at Auschwitz and Dachau, et cetera. The truth is that most of those camps, the prisoners at most of those camps, and they were prisoners, were not released for many, many months, in most cases, usually 2 to 3 years, sometimes as long as 6 or 7 years, because no countries would take them, including the United States, until about 1950, until about 5 years after the war. And Truman sent an emissary. He was the dean of the Penn Law School about 6 months after the end of the war to tour to give him basically an audit of the displaced persons camps, because Jewish groups had begun talking about these decrepit conditions of the people who we had just quote unquote freed. And the report that came back to Truman was really mind-blowing. It said, and I'm quoting almost verbatim here, I think, that we, the United States, are treating the Jews no differently than the Nazis did, except that we are not killing them. Think about that. That really gives you chills. And the conditions got a little bit better after that. They got a little bit more food, these people who were literally starving to death, and they were at least segregated from their Jewish persecutors. They no longer had to listen to the Nazi officers bossing them around the bunks, at least. So, okay, that was progress. But they were still, under lock and key in the camps, under armed guard for, in most cases, as I said, 2 to 3 years after that.
Let's talk about the heroes and the villains in the American government in regard to hiding the Nazis that we claim were denazified, and the heroes and the villains. Obviously, as I said, Elizabeth Holtzman is a hero in this. Who are some other heroes?
Yeah, well, Holtzman, it's worth taking a few seconds to talk about how she became involved in this. This was sort of America's secret shame for 30 plus years after the war, from 1945, and we began letting Nazis in within months. I mean, by the end of 1945, there was already a parade of Nazis coming in. Until the mid-70s, there was little to nothing done about this. And I'll come back for a second to the guy in Seal Beach, Artukovich. We have him to blame for that, in part because he was one of the first ones who actually was identified in the early 1950s, so just about 6-7 years after the war. And to their credit, the Justice Department actually tried to bring a case against him then to have him deported from the country, and the courts ruled against them. The judge said that basically Nazis are not our problem. And the fact that this guy, this former Croatian Nazi puppeteer, is living in Seal Beach is not a matter for the U.S. courts. And that had a real chilling effect, along with other things, for years and years. And it wasn't until the late 1970s that any sort of furor began to mount over reports that there were reports that had been ignored for years. There were agitators, Jews and non-Jews, who were trying to bring attention to this issue, who were either A, ignored, or B, were put under surveillance by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI for being communist spies, for feeding what they claimed was this false narrative. And then in the late 70s, Elizabeth Holtzman and a few others got wind of this through some whistleblowers at the INS, and began calling for hearings and got some publicity going on this. And that led to the creation of a new unit at the Justice Department in 1979 called the Office of Special Investigations. And that was really a game changer. It was you could argue too little, certainly too late, but it did lead to many hundreds of investigations and prosecutions with people deported, stripped of their citizenship, publicly identified, loss of assets. And one of the heroes at that office that I talk about, I mentioned earlier, is Eli Rosenbaum at the Justice Department, who spent, he's still at the Justice Department now, spent close to 4 decades there, and just a dogged investigator who has basically vowed that that no matter how old a target is, and he just deported a guy who was in his mid-90s just a few months ago, as long as he meets the standards of the court in terms of being of able mind to assist in his defense, he's going to bring to bear the assets of the Justice Department and going after them. And he was the one who Eli was instrumental in finally getting Ivan Demjanjuk from Ohio deported. He was controversial. He was the one who was originally erroneously thought to be Ivan the Terrible, but was in fact a guard, just not the most infamous guard, and has been involved in hundreds of prosecutions.
Truly a hero.
Yes.
Let's shift to anti-Semitism in America today, the subject of your newest book. When's that book due out?
It will be, I've just started that, so it will be probably in 2 years, probably in 2022. So I've just...
Does it have a working title yet?
We're still working on that. We're kicking around different ideas, but it will look at anti-Semitism and hate crimes in general, not just against Jews, although certainly that has been much in the news over the last 6 months or so, but also Blacks, Muslims, LGBT, Hispanics, and others. And I know in Orange County, in your synagogue, directly affected by the tragedies of this and the alt-right and these really militaristic groups. So it's a really just troubling phenomenon, which the resurgence we've seen of a problem that I think most in law enforcement and human rights thought we had put the worst behind us. And now the last 4 or 5 years, beginning in about 2015, we've seen the numbers going up and up, and just the grotesqueness of the violence going up and up as well.
So let's talk about the role of the web in taking disparate white supremacist, neo-Nazi hate groups across the country, little pockets here and there. Let's talk about the role of the web in bringing them together and giving them a greatly amplified voice and outreach.
Absolutely, it's a massive problem. The bullhorn that the web has provided through underground sites, groups, sites called like 8chan and Gab and others that have become meeting rooms for white supremacists, and or as they call themselves, white nationalists, whatever name you want to use. Militaristic groups that traffic in fear-mongering and hate, and these ideas boomerang from not just around the country, but from one part of the world to another, where you have, for instance, the shooter in El Paso at the Walmart a year or so ago, less than a year now, who killed almost 30 people, almost all Hispanic there at the Walmart, writing manifestos, quoting, for instance, the shooter at a New Zealand mosque who killed almost 50 people, who in turn is quoting others from Norway, and you have this echo chamber that's created where these ideas that are built largely on falsehoods and hatred and just repugnant ideologies are transferred from one end of the world to the other, and certainly social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, et cetera, they have not gotten their arms around this. They've been forced to do a bit more the last year by U.S. regulators and by Congress, but still not nearly enough in the view of many in the human rights community. It is legitimately a difficult task to balance the First Amendment issues with the hate crime issues. We are a country that prides itself on free speech and First Amendment, and where do you cross that line into illegal hate speech? But it was only about a year ago that Facebook, for instance, banned white supremacists from their site. But it's a little bit like whack-a-mole, where you close them down in one place and they spring up in another.
Yeah, so what can we do about it, meaning the government, but also private institutions? In other words, there are different requirements for public universities, let's say, versus private universities, between the government and the publishers. And if let's say, Facebook or Twitter, if they're seen as publishers, those platforms, then they don't have to honor the First Amendment in the same way that the government does, do they?
Well, their position has been that they do not produce and edit and curate news. They are just the platform for it. So they are politically neutral. And as Mark Zuckerberg has said many times, just recently, I think in the last week, they don't want to be in the business of truth tellers and fact checking. They want it to be an open forum, which in theory and concept is a nice idea. Again, since we are a country built on the First Amendment. But are you also then becoming a facilitator for hate mongers? And clearly, in many cases, that has been what's happened. So it's been left to a lot of the private advocacy groups to really police the web and police these groups, because the sites themselves and the government have been unable or unwilling to do so. So you have groups like the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Center for Hate and Extremism, any number of other groups who have really created quite an apparatus in real time to try and track what's going on. Now, with encrypted communications and sophisticated methods of technology, that's a pretty daunting task. But they do manage to out quite a few of these really ugly extremist groups. There is a difference, though, between the public square that, let's say, Facebook says they are, between Hyde Park in London or Union Square in New York or something like that. There's a difference between a gathering place for free speech and monetized platform, right? Sure. This is this is monetized hate speech. I mean, that seems to be the incentive more than the First Amendment. Is there anything we can do about this as a government or as individuals? I mean, some people don't use Facebook out of principle, right? It's very hard for most people to say no to things. Certainly, there's been a rebellion because of the privacy concerns. I think people, first it was what we learned about Russia using bots and fake identities to interfere in the 2016 election, and now we've seen it with the alt-right, where there was just a story just today before you and I started talking about involving the rioting that started in Minneapolis and the protests there, with far-right groups using Twitter posing as far-left groups. These are white supremacists who are posing as Antifa, a far-left group, anti-fascist group, in order to try and spur agitation and rioting, and then blame it on the far left. So it's almost as if they've adopted the Russian tactics from 2016. It's certainly a worrisome phenomenon, and I don't know that there are any easy answers. As a father of teenagers, we try and be at least vaguely aware of what sites they're on, but the kids today are far more technologically adept than we were in younger years, and they have access to so much that it's a little bit overwhelming to see the amount that they're exposed to, and it's worrisome. Is there a way to measure, do you think, the effect of hate groups, either online or in person or demonstrations or whatever it might be? Is there a way to measure how much worse it is today than, let's say, 5 years ago, the example you gave, 2015, or how much worse it can be in 5 years from now? Well, certainly the numbers are going in the wrong direction by a lot of different data points in terms of the number of hate crimes reported by the FBI and by other data centers. Those have has spiked significantly, anywhere from 20 to 30 to 40%, depending on the group targeted, whether it's Jews or blacks or LGBT. Those are all going up. The number of hate groups in existence that are monitored by groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, over the last, I believe, 8 to 10 years, those have probably gone up fourfold to now more than probably 1,000 groups, 1,100 groups just on the far right. And some of the most reliable studies have said that killings in domestic attacks, which a decade ago were largely at the hands of Islamic-inspired terrorism, are now significantly outnumbered by far-right domestic terrorism. Anywhere about 75% at the hands of far-right groups, and we see that again coming back to the unrest today over the events in Minneapolis, where you have these groups that are either white supremacist by ideology or militia style, that's sort of a light version of white supremacy, where they are appear to be involved in agitation of the unrest in the streets, that they hope will lead to some sort of a civil war. Of course, the White House contests that. They blame it on Antifa. And we're still kind of sorting through what's going on, because it's changing hour to hour to see which groups are responsible. It may end up being a combination of both, from the far right and the far left. But certainly the far right, the supremacist ideologies are seeking to capitalize on what's going on today.
Let me ask you a final question, which is a little bit unfair of a question, but what do you think about systemic racism in the United States? Right now we're living through George Floyd and the aftermath and the protests and the police response and the very different response of different levels of government and different sides of the aisle. If racism is the original sin of the creation of the United States, as it's been often called, will there be a cure for this original sin, for this moral pandemic?
We certainly hope so in our lifetimes, but, I know as someone who was living in LA at the time of the Rodney King riots in 94 and covered those with the LA Times, we thought that was such an enormous tremor with major implications for the country that would be what it would do to finally turn the tide and put kind of this whole history of racism behind us. And we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, that it in many ways seems to be as bad, if not worse than ever, because it has led to almost this backlash from white supremacist types who, see, as they tell it, the great replacement. That's a phrase you hear from the white supremacists, that the minorities are not only beginning to outnumber them, but want to do away with them.
And Jews will not replace us. Jews are the agent of the replacement.
Right, that they will orchestrate all that. So it's a really combustible mix of factors that we're seeing now. Starting with the events of about 4 or 5 years ago in Ferguson, Missouri, and Black Lives Matter, and that seemed to have calmed a bit. We had a whole series of police officer-involved shootings with blacks that seemed to have luckily dissipated in around 2018 or so. And I guess every time you hope, like, okay, we've turned the corner, boy, then there's just another jolt and another wake-up call that tells you we haven't. So I wish I could be more hopeful. It seems like the protests you see in the streets are a sign that many young people of all races are not willing to let this slide and just give government a pass. How it ends, I don't know. I wish I could give
This might be like a cancer that a person manages rather than a cancer that can be cured. We look at Jewish mobility, let's say, and achievement and status. And the American Jewish community kind of felt where we were so beyond this. And then we see the uprising of it. And I wonder, as there is greater African American and Latino mobility and achievement and status, if also that hatred will still be there. The evidence right now is unfortunately yes, but let's hope for a better day.
Yes, we all hope for it. Yeah, we're in the middle of just such a period of national angst that it's difficult to fathom, and obviously the response from the White House, being myself being here in Washington, seeing what happened at Lafayette Park with the clearing of protesters through tear gas and flashbangs and peaceful protesters, for a photo op, certainly does not give comfort that there's a strong federal presence to lead us out of this state we're in.
Well, Eric, thank you so much. It's really just an honor to
my pleasure.
Interview you and to learn from your wisdom. So
thank you very much, Rabbi. Yes, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.